So, welcome everybody. Happy Halloween and welcome to Maureen Murdock. Thank you so much for coming, Maureen.
Thank you
Um,
for the invitation. This is fun and frightening.
well, hopefully we'll make it less frightening, but it is Halloween after all, so a little fear isn't, doesn't hurt anyone. But it's
Perfect.
just it's a real I don't know how to say it, just a genuine gift to have you here sharing about your work, your long standing work in the area of memoir, in the area of myth as it relates to memoir, your background as a psychotherapist. I'm really interested to understand better how that informs these areas of memoir and myth. So I just want to share with everyone who's here, who's listening, a little bit about Maureen more formally. So Maureen is a Jungian-oriented psychotherapist who's been teaching memoir writing since 1990 in the UCLA Extension Writers Program and at Pacifica Graduate Institute. Her work explores the mysteries of the psyche, a fascination with mythology, and a love for storytelling and memoir. In 1990, she wrote the best-selling book, The Heroine's Journey, as a response to Joseph Campbell's Hero's Journey. It was groundbreaking at the time and continues to inspire a new generation of women.
Mm.
Her forthcoming book, Myth-Making, Self-Discovery and the Timeless Art of Memoir, explores the connections between ancient myths and popular contemporary memoirs to help readers examine their own life patterns and map their personal stories. It's going to be published by Shambhala in March of 2024.
Oh,
How does that feel?
yeah, that felt great. Thank you very much. Now you've completed everything and I can go.
Right. And scene. Thank you, Maureen. Um,
Thank you for the invitation to talk about this actually before the book is published. So that's fun.
yeah, I know the book is a long time in coming, which I kind of want to dive into that a little in a little bit. But I want to start by just kind of maybe sharing a little bit about your background and kind of giving us some context for where your journey with myth and memoir began.
I'd say my background growing up as a little Catholic girl, I went to Mass every morning and knelt in front of the statue of Mary and read the lives of the saints and the lives of the martyrs. And so I think, going back to the very beginning of my relationship with myth, it had to do with that early background. And then I went to Pacific Oaks College for my master's, which is in Pasadena. And I had this wonderful mentor, Polly McVicker, who introduced us to Joseph Campbell's work. So that was in the 70s. And we were reading parts of The Hero with a Thousand Faces. And then Campbell came up to Santa Barbara from New York in the late 70s and early 80s. He came to what at that point was the Human Relations Institute, which became Pacifica Graduate Institute. And he would come for a long weekend, talk to us about myth and have us enact a myth. So it wasn't just, the two-dimensional experience, it was
Hmm.
enacting myths. And then I moved up from Venice to Santa Barbara in 1998 to become chair of the MA counseling program. And I started to teach myth and memoir to my students. And we also enacted we enacted the Demeter Persephone myth, which was great fun. So, starting from a child to now, I think it was really kind of in my blood, from the early exposure to Lives of the Saints. I found out last week my granddaughter, Jilly, who goes to Scripps, she's in her senior year, and I asked her, what's your thesis going to be? And she said, I'm doing the medieval church and women martyrs. And I thought, how did that happen? She did not grow up going to mass. So it must be in the lifeblood. It's
Right. I think
pretty
your legacy, yes, your legacy
yeah.
is
Yeah,
continues.
it's kind of a strange thing to think that your legacy is going to be about martyrs. But she's really interested in how the church treated women, which, as we all know, it hasn't changed.
So tell me again, you went up to Pacifica
To
to
chair
chair
the
the
MA counseling program.
okay. And I think I'm curious to understand, and you jumped right into, and you worked with the Demeter Persephone myth inside of that. But can you make the connection for us between how you incorporated myth into your psychotherapy and into the program? Like why that was sort of just for you, it just sounds so natural.
Well, I think, so many myths, the, culturally, across all cultures, there's different themes within myth. There's the theme of the virgin birth. There's the theme of the unusual birth, the virgin birth being Mary, the unusual birth, for example, being Athena out of Zeus's head. There's the fall from grace, the fall from innocence, Adam and Eve. There are the quests. There's the longing for the mother by the daughter. There's the betrayal by the father. There's I already mentioned the quest. There's the descent. There's renewal. All of these themes also come up in a person's psyche. And so oftentimes looking at the patterns that are reoccurring in a person's life, the lens that I would look at it would happen to be mythic. So
And you referenced Demeter and Persephone. Can you just share a little for those who don't know that myth, what it is and how you worked
sure.
with it?
Yeah. The story goes that Demeter, who was the grain goddess, the agricultural goddess, she and her daughter Persephone, the young daughter Persephone, were in a meadow one day, and they were picking flowers. The meadow being a symbol of a liminal place, and those we've all been in a liminal place where we didn't know what our next step was going to be, right? So Persephone is there with some of her girlfriends, other young goddesses, and they're picking flowers. And then all of a sudden, Persephone sees this 100-petal narcissus, this beautiful, beautiful flower, and she reaches out and plucks it from the ground. And in that moment, Hades, who is traveling in his golden chariot drawn by 4 horses, grabs her and takes her into the underworld. So the earth closes up. Demeter comes back. Well, first of all, Persephone screams, but we don't know where she went, right? And her mother comes back to the meadow and says, "Where's Persephone? Where's Persephone?" And no one knows. And so Persephone takes torches and she travels over land and sea for 9 days looking for her daughter, asking everyone, "Where's Persephone?" And nobody knows. She comes back to the meadow. And you think about nine, you think about the symbol of nine, pregnancy. She comes back to the meadow and she meets with, now I'm forgetting, the goddess with three heads who can see from in front of her on either side. And she says, "Did you see where it's Hecate? Did you see where Persephone went?" And this is a perfect Halloween story. And Hecate says, "No, I didn't see, but let's go up to Helios, the sun god, and ask him where she went because he sees everything." So they go to Helios. They ask, "Did you see where Persephone went?" And he says, "Well, yes, she was taken into the underworld to be the bride of Hades." To be the bride of Hades. Here she is, this young girl. And he also says it was sanctioned by Zeus because Hades is Zeus's brother. Okay, so here we have this young girl abducted into the underworld. We're looking at incest, right? Because Hades is the brother of Zeus and Zeus is her father. And Demeter says, "Nobody asked me. Nobody asked me. Nobody asked Persephone." And she is furious. And Helios basically says, "What are you so angry about? Here, your daughter has just married the king of the underworld. She will be his queen." So anyway, at this point, Demeter leaves Mount Olympus and says she will never be back. And since she is the goddess of grain, the goddess of agriculture, she creates famine across the world. Nothing grows. And she says, "Nothing will grow until I get my daughter back." So, think about that in the psyche when you feel completely barren and arid. So anyway, Demeter, our next vision of Demeter is she goes to Eleusis and sits by the well and she cries. Her tears go into the well. And the daughters of Celeus is the king of Eleusis, they come to the well to gather water. And they ask her, what she's doing there. And she's in disguise. And she says, "I want to be a nursemaid to a child." And they say, "Well, our mother has had a late life child, Demophoon. And so let us go and ask our mother if maybe you can come and work for us." So they go home, they ask their mother says, bring this woman to me. So Demeter, I said she's in disguise. She comes into the palace and immediately Metanera, the mother, recognizes something about this woman. She's in disguise, but she recognizes something. And she says, "Come and sit next to me in this throne." And Demeter says, "No, I'll sit on a footstool." And I'm sorry, Metanera asks her handmaiden to bring Demeter wine, and she says, "No, I'll just have barley water." So, she appears very humble. And Metanera asks her if she wants to take care of this new baby boy, Demophoon, and Demeter says yes. So each night, with the door closed, Demeter takes the baby and puts it into the fire to make him immortal, and also feeds him food of the gods, because she wants an immortal child back. And one night, Demeter had left the door open just a little bit. Metanera sees what she's doing. She rushes into the room, says, "What are you doing? This is my child." And Demeter throws him to the ground. And at that moment, she rises to her full power and she says, "I want a temple built for me, and I will sit there until I get my daughter back." So Celeus gathers the other kings of the neighborhood. They build her temple, and she sits there and she waits and she waits. And as I mentioned to you before, nothing has been growing in the land. There's just famine. And so the other gods and goddesses go to Zeus and say, you know, everyone is going to die unless you bring Persephone back from the underworld. And he says, no, she'll get over it. Well, she doesn't get over it. She sits there and waits and waits and waits. And the other gods and goddesses go back to Zeus again and say, we need to bring Persephone back. And so he sends Hermes, who is the god who can go between the worlds. He sends Hermes down to the underworld and tells Hades that Persephone needs to leave. And before she leaves, Hades circles her 3 times, each time giving her a pomegranate seed. And then she is taken back in the chariot to the upper world. She gets out of the chariot. Her mother sees her. They run and they embrace. And Demeter then says to Persephone, did you eat anything in the underworld? Because the ritual of the underworld is, if you eat anything in the underworld, you can never return. And at first, Persephone says, no, I didn't have anything. And so Demeter says, are you sure? And she said, well, I only had 3 seeds. And so what happens at this point is that there's a negotiation between Rhea, who is Demeter's mother, and Zeus and Hades, that Persephone will return to the underworld for 3 months of the year, and the rest of the time she can be in the upper world with her mother. So it is this wonderful story of the mother-daughter relationship and how the mother will do anything to get her daughter back. And symbolically, we all have Demeter and Persephone within us. And how do we take care of our inner self, our inner child, inner woman? So I don't know whether that telling that story gives you a sense of the symbols that you can look at in a myth and see where you are in your life. You know, how are you, Demeter? How are you, Persephone? How are you, Zeus? How are you, Hades? In terms of Hades, you know, how have you been abducted? How have you abducted others? It's very rich looking at a myth personally. Chris Downing wrote a book called, I think it's The Long Journey Home, where she was looking at the Persephone myth in terms of her own life. because she identifies strongly with Persephone.
Hmm. Well, thank you for sharing that. And yes, it is rich with symbols. And I love how you made the connection to all the things that we can explore as writers as we're looking at our own stories, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a bit. So your work, I'm just wondering about your connection. I wanted to kind of dive into the heroine's journey and where that came from in you. Um, and also the Demeter Persephone myth is largely, I'm imagining, geared towards the female experience, but maybe I'm inaccurate in assuming that. So just, can you kind of use that myth as maybe a segue into talking more about the heroine's journey and how that emerged?
Yeah, well, how it emerged is some of you may remember Bill Moyer's series with Joseph Campbell called The Power of Myth. Any
Yes,
of you
definitely.
remember that? Well, that was, I think that was late 70s, early 80s. Anyway, I was a therapist at the time, and I ran a 10-month group for men and women on the hero's journey, on the stages of the hero's journey, from the book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, and also from The Power of Myth. And also at that time, you may or may not remember, it was very exciting in the culture because Star Wars was coming out. And of course, Star Wars reflects the monomyth of the hero's journey. I mean, they used Campbell's monomyth of the hero's journey to write Star Wars. So we were going through the different stages of the hero's journey in this 10-month group that I was doing with men and women. And by the end of that, I began to realize that the hero's journey really didn't address the deep wounding of the feminine for most women and for, of course, many men. So I started, for those of you who've read the book, I created the diagram of the heroine's journey, really thinking about, in some ways, the Demeter Persephone myth, because it follows the stages of the heroine's journey. But I took the monomyth, or the diagram that I had created of the heroine's journey, back to New York to show it to Joseph Campbell. And at the time, he said to me famously, Maureen, women don't need to make the journey because they're the place that everyone is trying to get to. And I said, well, that's not true for certainly the women that I work with in therapy and teaching, and my colleagues, women of my generation. We are making a journey. We're very over-identified with the masculine, and the culture also is really wounded in the aspect of the feminine. And if he meant that women hold the place that everyone is trying to get to, if he meant that in terms of the feminine or the spiritual, I think it would be true mythologically, but culturally and personally at that time, women needed a different mythos. They needed a different map, in a sense. So that's where that book came from. His response made me write the book, because I thought, well, I've got to figure this out. So that book came out at a particular time. It came out in 1990, where all of us were looking for some answers to what was going on personally and culturally. And that book is now in 20 languages. So it was, it didn't just coincide with what was going on in the US, but certainly in other cultures. It's even in Farsi.
Amazing.
So, I'm thrilled by that,
That's amazing.
the women in the Middle East have access to it, even though it's apparently heavily redacted.
What did I mean, over the years, how did Joseph Campbell respond to his famous quote that inspired your book? I mean, did you ever revisit that conversation with him?
No, I mean, I think he died in 82. My book didn't
Oh.
come out till 90. Uh,
Oh, wow.
yeah,
Okay.
so it took me 8 years to write it.
Hmm. Hmm. So, what about this new book that's forthcoming, Myth Making? Mm, Why? I know it's been a long time in coming. What has been gestating over the years, and why is it coming out now? Can you speak to that?
Well, I finally finished it. That's why it's coming out now. Um, it in terms of gestation, all of the time that I was teaching myth and memoir, um, well, I guess, let me think about this. Because Campbell, I really took his domains of myth very seriously. He asks, who am I? Who are my people? What's my journey? And what's my purpose? And those are the general domains of myth. And when I was teaching, well, first of all, going back to when I started teaching memoir at UCLA Extension, there weren't any memoirs. So that was the early 90s. There were autobiographies, but there weren't memoirs until 94, 95 with Angela's Ashes and the Liars Club. So, they began the whole really explosion of memoir writing. And throughout, so that's mid 90s. And here we are, 2023. It took me that long to start to look at the patterns between myth and memoir. Uh,
Mm,
I was teaching it first at UCLA, then teaching it at Pacifica, then teaching it at Sonoma State. And over that period, I read pretty close to 80 memoirs, but they have been slowly evolving. You ask why now? It really is. I'm a very slow writer, slow thinker, I guess. Um, so, between being a mother, raising children, working, and writing, it's taken that long. When I was teaching at Pacifica, I started to write Unreliable Truth, which was my first book on memoir. And at that time, I was starting to look at the parallels between myth and memoir, but that book took a different turn. And that's what happens when you write. You start out doing one thing. And at the same time, my mother had Alzheimer's. And so I started to look at the relationship between memory and identity as her Alzheimer's progressed. So that the first part of that book
mm,
has much more to do with memory
mm,
and my relationship with my mother. And the second part of the book is how to write a memoir, basically. And that came out in 2003. So, as you
mm,
can see, it's taken 20 years from that book for this one to evolve and to be published.
Well, that makes a lot of sense that, when you describe that explosion of memoirs in the mid 90s and taking the time to look at the patterns over the years. I mean, it makes total sense that, there's kind of this evolution of memoir and you noticing and observing the connections with myth, which seems to be your kind of home base. So
Yeah.
where did memoir kind of surface? I mean, you're a psychotherapist and working with myth, and then you're also at the same time, is it through the therapy and working with people's stories that then you to start taking a deeper interest in the craft of memoir itself?
Yeah, I think, being a psychotherapist primarily with women, I mean, to some, I would say 75% of my clients were women, another 25% men. Anyway, listening to stories over the decades and hearing the patterns. Um, but well, that certainly helped me see connection to myth. So it was much later that I started to see the connection to memoirs as they started to be published. So I've been learning as the books have been coming out.
Mhm.
Um, yeah. And I'm an experiential writer in the sense that I write from either what I teach or what I experience myself.
Mhm. Mhm. So, can you talk maybe then a little bit more about the book itself and how you structured it and what you were exploring? Because there's really two main parts of the book. Part one is exploring these questions, these fundamental questions that myth explores. Can you speak to that a little bit more,
Sure. Yeah, sure.
and their relationship to memoir writing?
Yeah. Let's look at the different questions in terms of memoirs. The first question, who am I? I mean, I guess every memoir is answering that question. But I was looking at particular memoirs, like Danny Shapiro writes Inheritance. And that whole book is a search for her biological father. Because what happens in Inheritance is one day she takes a DNA test and finds out that her father, who she grew up with, who was a Orthodox Jew, and she was Jewish, but she was blonde and light skinned and never looked like anyone else in her family. And she always felt a little bit like she didn't belong. And all of a sudden, I think at 54, she takes the DNA test and finds out that her dad, who she was very closely identified with, was not her birth father. And she wants to know, well, who was. So the book is an exploration of that. But her question, I think, in looking at myth and memoir, what is the narrative pattern? And her question is, if my father isn't my father, then who am I? Because I've thought I was one person for 54 years, but I'm someone else. And so that book explores that entire question. Another Who Am I memoir. And I just want to back up and say that the ones that I'm going to be mentioning to you, it's my lens. I mean, you might read the book and say, I don't know what she was talking about. That book wasn't Who Am I? So just know that. One of the other ones that I have in my book is Blessed by Thunder by Flor Fernandez Barrios. And that book is the book of her, about her birth and her beginnings and her namings, which I see oftentimes in certain memoirs. She was born during a thunder and lightning storm in Havana, Cuba, where all the lights went out. And her grandmother, who was a curandera, a healer, started to pray to Saint Teresa, the Little Flower, and said to Saint Teresa, if this child is born safely and is healthy, I will teach her to become a curandera, and her name will be Flor, in honor of Saint Teresa, the Little Flower. So Flor's book is all about that journey that starts with her birth. And does she become a curandera? I'm not going to answer that. You'll have to read the book yourself, but it's fascinating that the beginning is about her birth and her naming. So then I started to think about, okay, what other books answer the question, who am I? And
What's the name of that book?
that book is Blessed by Thunder.
Okay.
And it's Flor Fernandez Barrios, Barrios.
So what's another question? And it's interesting to hear you make the connections to specific memoirs.
Actually, I want to just do one more.
Oh, who am I?
Yeah.
Okay.
Jeanette Winterson wrote, why be happy when you can be normal? She was adopted. So again, this is the theme of the beginning and who am I? She was adopted and raised by Mrs. Winterson, who she had a very difficult time with because she was gay, and Mrs. Winterson rejected her for being gay. That's where the title comes from. You know, why be happy when you could be normal? Mm-hmm. So part of her journey is to find her birth mother. So again, it answers the question, or tries to answer the question, who am I? The next question that Campbell, or in terms of the domains of myth that I was looking at, who are my people? And one of the books that I was looking at was The Yellow House. I have to see if I can remember the Sarah Broom wrote The Yellow House, and it's about what happened during the Hurricane Katrina. The Yellow House, where her mother raised, I think it was 8 children, was destroyed in the hurricane, and all of the children scattered. So in a sense, the tribe scatters, and Sarah Broom keeps coming back to New Orleans and coming back and coming back. She can't, what's the word? She can't let go of the remains of the Yellow House. And she can't let go of her mother because her mother stayed, everybody else left, except for one brother who goes to the site of the destroyed Yellow House, and he stands sentry. I mean, it's just such a touching story about tribe or people and home. Mm-hmm. So that for me answered the story, who are my people? Okay, what is my journey? Probably a lot of you have read Cheryl Strayed's Wild, you know, when she takes that amazing hike up the Pacific Coast Trail. And we travel with her, and it's not just to travel on the trail in shoes that don't fit. she's grieving the loss of her mother. Her mother has died, and she does this, I think, 3 years later. So we travel with her. Um, Another book that I was thinking about in terms of what's my journey is Chanel Miller's Know My Name, where she tells the story of having been raped by a Stanford student, and she takes him to court, and she goes through that whole process, which it's an extraordinary book. She's an amazing writer. Um, if you're looking for a book that really shows a writer who can reflect upon her experience throughout the entire book, and she just has so much courage. So that's
So
one.
much courage.
Yeah.
Tell me, can you explain a little bit more, like, what is my journey? Because I feel like you could look at inheritance and that could be about what's my journey. So, what is specific about that question that we need to know?
Um, if you're at all conscious of being on a particular type of journey, I mean, yes, you're right. These memoirs can answer all those questions. Who am I? Who are my people? What's my journey? And what's my purpose, which I'm going to get to. Um, why did I put it there? Is that
Mhm.
your
Yeah,
question?
why did you pick Chanel's book, like, to answer that specific, as related to that question, answering that question?
Because it really looked like that was the narrative pattern, was more about journey. It could also be about identity. I mean, none of this is fixed.
Right, got it.
It's just my particular lens
Mm-hmm.
at that particular time.
Mm-hmm.
The next question, though, is what is my purpose, or where do I fit in? And um, the Creek poet, Joy Harjo, who wrote Crazy Brave, she says in that book, right at the beginning, I was born to be a poet for my people. So when I'm reading that, I'm thinking that's part of her narrative pattern. Um, she's answering the question, what is my purpose? Another one, and this one could definitely go in identity or my people. James McBride, who wrote The Color of Water, in that book, his purpose was to understand himself as an African American man with a Jewish heritage, since his mother was a white Jewish woman. And I think his purpose there was getting a deeper sense of his identity.
Hmm.
Another one is Mary Jane Nealon, Nealon. She wrote Beautiful Unbroken. She's a wonderful, wonderful poet. Um, and the beginning of her book is, I always wanted to be a saint. That's her direct quote. I always wanted to be a saint. And then she writes about how she tried to be a saint as a young girl, and she realized that she committed too many sins to be a saint. So she watched her, I think it was an aunt, walk around in her nurse outfit, and she decided, oh, okay, if I can't be a saint and if I can't be heroic, I'll be a nurse. And she was a nurse in the 80s in New York during the AIDS epidemic. So I come out of reading that book thinking she was a saint. So those are the four questions that I was looking at, as you said, in the first part of the book. And then the latter part of the book, I'm looking at certain archetypes. And the archetypes that I was looking at were home and the longing for home. There was the body and wounding, exile and loss and death, and then spirituality. And in terms of the body, I guess one of the questions that I was looking at in different memoirs were, what do we learn from our wounds? And I mentioned Chanel Miller before. That's certainly a book that answers that question. Home and homecoming, I think that's a recurring theme that most of us deal with, whether we're looking for home or we're fleeing home or we're longing for home. And there's many memoirs that look at that. Gabriel Byrne, the actor Gabriel Byrne, wrote a memoir, and I'm forgetting the title right now, but he made it into a one-man show, which is about his longing for home, and his home, of course, is Ireland. Another memoir that I thought was really interesting about home, and she calls it real estate, is Deborah Levy, Levy, and the book is called Real Estate, Real Estate. So you think it's going to be, I don't know. I certainly didn't think it was what it ended up being. She's talking about the empty nest, and then how do you then fill it? And what would you fill it after mothering? Because you fill it so differently during mothering. And is it really about filling it, or is it about the longing? So that's a very interesting book, the way she looks at that. In terms of exile, I mean, whole peoples, whole cultures have been exiled, as you know. And so there's several books about choosing exile or being exiled. One that really touched me deeply was Homera Kadiri, who's an Afghani woman who was exiled by her husband because he wanted a second wife. And so, in being exiled from the family, she was exiled from the child that she had just given birth to at the time that she was still nursing him. And the form that the book takes is in a letter to her son, trying to explain why she's not with him.
Oh, gosh.
Unfortunately, I'm forgetting the title of it, but I'll give you the spelling of her last name. It's Qaderi, Qaderi. First name is Homera, Homeira,
Okay.
Homeira. And then there's loss and death, which is, a very compelling archetype. Probably many of you have read Joan Didion's The Year of Magical Thinking. Gail Caldwell wrote The Long Journey Home about the death of her best friend. And Isabel Allende wrote Paula about the death of her daughter. So these are all memoirs, and about different archetypes. And the last one I was looking at was spirituality. And in terms of what are the mysteries that we're trying to understand. And one book that addresses that is Karen Armstrong's The Spiral Staircase.
Mm.
I have many more books that I mention in my book, Myth Making, but I just wanted to give you some examples.
Mm. No, super helpful. I think the big question is, how do we, as memoirists, use myth, explore myth to help deepen and discover our own stories? I mean, where do we even begin? At what stage of the writing process do you?
I really think it's just a matter of thinking about these questions, particularly the questions of who am I, who are my people, what's my journey, and what's my purpose. Um, I want to be really careful about um, being clear that this is just an approach. You know, none of you have to write a mythic memoir. These are just ideas. You know, the more you read memoirs, you might start percolating in terms of, oh yeah, they're addressing their family, or she's addressing this particular phase of her life. That's what I'm addressing too. So you don't have to weave a myth into your memoir. It's really just a matter of thinking about these questions, or thinking thinking about them in terms of theme. You know, what's my own theme? And you're not going to know that at all at the beginning of your writing. You just aren't. You know, that comes much later. In fact, it might not come until you're finished writing your memoir, and then you can say, oh, that's what I was addressing all of the time. Does that help?
It does. Yeah, it's not the idea. It's not. It's going to be using it to. I mean, I like the idea of using it to help deepen some of your themes, or some of the. I mean, what do you mean by? I think it would help. I think to understand what you mean by patterns and archetypes, and I think there's maybe a sense that, like, oh, when I talk to people about some of your work, it's like, oh, well, does that mean that I'm going to shoehorn you know, my memoir into some narrative pattern? And why would I want to do that? Why would
No,
right. So I think maybe I understand where you're coming from, but I, I think it would help to know, like, to study it's not just being aware of the questions that you're exploring, but actually working with some of the myths and how can they help deepen um, our storytelling. Do you know what I mean? Beyond, I think it's beyond just, oh, I'm answering that question. Um,
well, if I answer that question, how do I look at what's going on in my story? Is there a way to deepen it? Like the woman who wrote Memorial Road, which is about her mother's, um, her mother was killed by her stepfather. She does integrate the Persephone myth, because she talks about the first day her mother is going to work in a cafe called the Underworld. She gives her a bouquet of flowers, and she says in the memoir, did I, by giving her that bouquet of flowers, did I activate her journey to the underworld? So, in a sense, she's asking herself if she is
mm,
like Persephone,
mm,
and or she's the one who activates her mother's descent.
Mhm.
And other memoirists also use parts of myth. Um, Winterson uses myth. I think it depends upon what your interest is as a writer. You may start to read certain myths and think, oh, I can use that aspect in my own journey,
Mhm.
or not. Um,
Right.
I really want to be clear about the fact that you're not shoehorning. It's
Mhm.
it's as if you were looking at Shakespeare and reflecting upon how something that Shakespeare wrote also fits your memoir.
Mhm.
So
Right, right, right.
but you asked before about an archetype, and an archetype is a particular theme that recurs over and over and over again in life and in literature. Um, the Descent is one that we find in so many movies, right? And in so many ballets. I took my granddaughter to see a Balanchine ballet a couple of weeks ago, and here they were enacting the Orpheus myth.
Mm.
So these ancient myths are reenacted over and over again. And memoir, we're doing the same thing in a sense. We're reenacting what happened to us in the past in the form of writing. So
Mm.
they parallel what happened then and how do I look at it now.
And I love your example of the autobiography of a face. Lucy Greeley's. Can you explain how she
Oh, you know what? When I was talking to you, I think I think you'll have to tell me what we had a conversation
it was
about.
about how she used the myth of Narcissus and
Yeah, that was not her.
oh,
That
okay.
yeah, that was the book. The title of the book is Smile, and it's Sarah Ruhl,
Okay.
Ruhl, who's a playwright.
Okay.
She had Bell's palsy, and she does use the myth of Narcissus in talking about how we how we see ourselves reflected by the world when our face can't move. It's very powerful. It's a wonderful memoir, Smile,
Mhm.
the story of a face.
Great. Thank you. There's a question here. Are there modern myths? Well, I feel like I can answer that because Maureen says that we are the contemporary myth makers as memoirists. Can you speak to that?
We're the modern myth. It's our story now.
Mhm.
We're enacting all of those myths. Um, in terms of a modern myth in film, we've got Barbie. In a sense, Barbie leaves the known world and goes to quote the real world and goes through trials and tribulations, comes back to the Barbie world transformed. So the modern myth, in a very positive way, is Barbie.
Well, and but you do talk about how we as memoirists are actively making the myths current day myths, correct?
Well, I think our memoirs are the current day myths. That's why my PhD dissertation was, the title was Memoirist as Contemporary Myth Maker, because I think that's what we're doing.
Mm. So powerful. I feel like just raises the work of memoir to this, you know, how do
Other
I say,
level.
other
Yeah,
level. Yeah.
we're not just looking at our navels as we are sometimes accused of. But we are creating the new cultural myth.
Mhm. So powerful. Another question, when writing a very factual piece and seeing which journey or question applies, how might one deepen the story? Would a fictional addition that points to the myth undermine the memoir?
Mhm. That's a big question in terms of bringing in fiction. It wouldn't be a memoir anymore. It would be a fictional memoir.
Mhm.
So you can certainly do that and just don't call it a memoir.
Mhm. Well, I thought it was interesting when I spoke to you, is like, can we apply, um, as you're looking at the relationship between myth and memoir, can we apply that to novel writing, other kinds of storytelling? And you were saying to me, well, it, you know, novelists aren't necessarily really exploring the same questions that myth is exploring. I mean, I suppose they could be, but
Yeah,
memoir inherently are looking at the very same questions that myth looks at. Am I accurate when I say
yeah,
that?
that's accurate. Novelists might be exploring the same questions, but they're not telling their personal story as a memoir. They might be telling their personal story as fiction.
So can novelists then look to myth as well?
Oh, sure. Novelists look to myth all the time. So do playwrights. So do filmmakers. Chris Vogel, who wrote The Writer's Journey, uses Campbell's monomyth for all writing.
Mhm.
So, in terms of answering that last question, that person might want to take a look at that book, The Writer's Journey by Chris Vogel.
Mhm. Mhm. Um, is there a myth of daughter seeking father?
Oh, yes. I wrote a book called Father's Daughters, Breaking the Ties That Bind, which that whole book includes myths about the father-daughter relationship, but certainly Athena, who, as I mentioned before, was birthed out of the head of Zeus. Her whole journey is of being a father's daughter. So, you might want to take a look at that, Father's Daughters, Breaking the Ties That Bind. But look at the myth of Athena.
Great. And
And
yeah, go
there's
ahead.
others. Yeah, there's others, but go ahead.
One last question here. What do you see as the differences between autobiographies and memoirs? Why have autobiographies, or at least this term, fallen out of favor and memoirs have risen?
Well, an autobiography goes usually from the person's birth or the beginning of the story all the way to when the person is writing it, like Personal History by Catherine Graham, which really is the story of was it the Washington or Wall Street Journal? No, it's Washington Post. Um,
Oh, right.
Memoirs are a slice of life. They're not a whole life. Um, Autobiographies most of the time include it's much more of a factual journey. Memoirs is much more about emotional memory and reflection. You have to have reflection in memoir, or else really doesn't work. Um, so autobiographies are usually about exploits and challenges and success. And memoirs are more personal. They can be we hope they're universal, but there's a big difference.
Hmm. Definitely. Um, And what is your feeling about why memoir it continues it's to grow and expand and evolve? It's
because we all want to know how everyone else gets through their life. We, we I think it's because memoir really brings people together. It's very much about community. We want to hear people's stories. We want to know how they approached their different challenges. We want to know about their successes and failures. We want to empathize with them. So I just think memoir, and I've said this before, not today, I also think we learn so much more about ourselves, our loved ones, and our culture in reading memoirs and in writing memoir.
I think it's a powerful way to also change the world. I mean, through these connections and telling our personal stories. Would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, absolutely. We get to think together.
Think.
Think. Yeah, think.
Hmm.
Is my journey like your journey?
Mm.
What
Mhm.
can I learn from your journey?
I always, when I work with a memoirist, I think of how is your story contributing to a larger conversation? Like I love that you're saying we get to think together. We're in conversation with one another through telling our stories, through sharing our stories.
Right. And we're
Mhm.
learning about other cultures, which is so important.
Mhm. Mhm. Well, thank you, Maureen, so much for
Oh, you're
coming
welcome.
today.
Thank you so much. This has been a wonderful conversation, and I appreciate all you're doing in the writing community, which
Mm.
is going out not just in LA, but across the country.
Mm.
So thank you for that. Thank you for your work.